All right, well, good evening. My name is Travis Smith. I am an assistant professor of philosophy and religion here at Central Methodist University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 13th annual Fleer Lecture here at CMU. This lecture series is generously funded by Dr. Gilbert Fleer and his wife, Ruth. Dr. Fleer was an assistant professor of religion here at CMU from 1959 to 1965. He went on to serve as a United Methodist counselor for many years, where he counseled young adults. The Fleer's strong support of leadership training led them to fund the Gil and Ruth Fleer Fund for Excellence in Values-Based Education at CMU. On behalf of the Department of Religion and Philosophy and Central Methodist University, I thank the Fleers for their continued support and generosity. Several people have contributed to making this event happen tonight. I would like to thank Bill Sheehan, Janice Perkins, Stasia Sherman. I also would like to thank Scott Queen, Joe Wayner, and the Office of Marketing and Communications. I'd like to thank Provost Rita Goldstad and President Roger Drake, and my colleagues, especially Daryl Jeffries and Kevin Carnahan. And I'd like to thank each of you for joining us tonight for an exciting talk that is very timely. So at this point, I'll just invite Dr. Carnahan up to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Hold your applause for the actual speaker. Okay, I'm Kevin Carnahan, professor of philosophy and religion, and you are all lucky this evening to be able to hear Tobias Winright come and speak to you. So Tobias actually served in uniform before going back to school, and in part during going back to school, which is important because as opposed to many people in the area of ethics, he actually did the things that he writes about. I recall, I've known Tobias for some time. He's an outstanding scholar. He's edited many volumes and written many articles. But my biggest memory with Tobias was probably more than 12 years ago. I went to the Society of Christian Ethics, and I heard Tobias give a talk there. And I don't remember exactly what the topic of the talk was now. He works both in just war ethics and in policing ethics, two areas that I'm interested in, and so I went to his presentation. But what I remember about it was that at the end, there were a group of Christian ethicists sitting in the room that had a set of questions or assumptions maybe about what you could do if you had a gun. And they started asking questions about whether you could avoid harming someone by like shooting the gun out of their hand or something like that. And Tobias had this kind of quizzical look on his face, and he had to explain to this room of ethicists the differences between what happens in a Hollywood movie and what happens in reality when you get into situations. So a person with both practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Very happy this evening to welcome Tobias Winright.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. I'm really excited to see you here. After COVID, it's nice to be doing things in person again, and I know it's the evening and there's a lot going on. So I've got a lot of slides. I don't have any notes. I'm just going to talk for 45 minutes and see if you have any questions, and we'll take it from there. I mean, I could go on all night. I grew up in Florida, and there were orange juice trees all around, and I tried to get a job at an orange juice factory one time, and they fired me after one day because I could not concentrate. Get it? Oh, no. No appeal on that one. All right. All right. I know he's very funny, so I have a high bar. But so I'm concentrating a lot into this tonight, so please concentrate with me. So I teach at St. Louis University. I've been there 17 years now. Before that, I taught 2 years at Walsh University in North Canton, Ohio, and 5 years at Simpson College, a Methodist-related college near Des Moines, Iowa. And so I've been doing this a long time, but as Kevin said, I've also done other things along the way. So next slide, please. Twice upon a time. So on the left there, that's me shaking a hand, graduating from the academy in 1984. And that's my mom in the middle. She's been on A&E, Discovery Channel, and the History Channel on cold cases shows. She was a patrol officer in Florida, Clearwater, St. Pete, Florida, where I went to middle school, high school, and college. And so that's me, and I was also in college at the same time. Community college, St. Petersburg Community College. And I'm the only person in my family that went to college. My parents did not. My younger brothers did not. 2 dropped out of high school. 1 finished high school. But I always wanted to go to college. I wanted to maybe go into law school, or I was also interested in ministry. I'm born and raised Catholic, though, and although none of them liked me, I did like girls. So the priesthood wasn't an option. So I thought about law school. And my senior year of high school, I lived with my dad because my mom and dad divorced. I lived with my dad, and he threw me out of the house, and I was on my own. So I got a job working at a pool hall, and then I worked at a lumber yard. I started taking classes at the community college, and I was like, I need to do something else to work my way through college. And so my mom, she was a cop, and she's like, why don't you apply at police departments and maybe get a job, especially if you think about law school later on. And so that's what I did, and I got hired by the same department where she worked. And she was patrol. When I was in high school, she even pulled me over. It was like bad having a mom as a cop. And she became a homicide detective. 1 year, she was runner-up police officer of the year for the whole state of Florida. And that's how she did serial murder cases, even a famous one that was, the guy was executed here in Missouri back in the late 90s, the mid-90s. Anthony Lorette was his name. And so that's what I did, midnight shift, full-time, for 4 years, while I went to college full-time during the daytime. And I slept a couple hours a day. And I transferred from the community college, went to the University of South Florida, and I was political science major, history minor. So whatever you're minoring in now doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to end up doing. It's something I changed along the way. I became interested in questions during that time having to do with the use of force, racism, the death penalty. These issues I thought hard about. I saw a lot of things. I experienced a lot of things. And I wrestled with them. And I had a political science professor that had me reading, even though it was political science, we read Augustine, a theologian. We read Thomas Aquinas. We read documents from Catholic bishops. And we wrestled with a lot of questions about war and peace. We wrestled with a lot of questions about, you name it, all sorts of ethical issues. So when I graduated, undergraduate, instead of law school, I ended up going to do a master's in theology and ethics at Duke. And I was there for a few years, and then I did campus ministry for a few years, although I'm not ordained. And then I went to Notre Dame to do my doctorate. And I wrote my dissertation, 367 pages, on the use of force and policing back in the 90s. So, because this was actually, I'm going to talk about tonight, something that not too many people have actually paid attention to until recently. So that's the next slide there. Go back. That's my keychain that says Notre Dame. And on that, I still have my first handcuff key from 1984 to always remind me of what I used to do. Because sometimes, I just don't want to forget. I don't want to forget. Next slide, please, Britt. So, when I first started writing about this, I started Notre Dame in 1993. That was my first year in my doctoral program, 2 years after the Rodney King incident out in Los Angeles. He was beaten by many, many police officers. And it was in the 90s, so we didn't have the phones we've got now. We didn't have the video and the camera, but somebody did capture that on film, and it made the national news. And I had seen similar things, I got to tell you, when I was on the job. Now, most of my fellow officers did not do such things, but I saw enough, and it bothered me. So that happened. Next slide, Britt. It reminded me of stuff I read about with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, and there's Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama in 1965, the dogs, and police brutality, excessive force. That concerned me. Next slide. 1997, Abner Louima in New York City was beaten by police officers while he was already in their custody. In fact, he was raped by the police officers. Next slide. Amadou Diallo, he was shot 41 times. Shots were fired at him. 1999. Next slide. 2014, Ferguson, right down my neck of the woods here in Missouri. The protest, St. Louis University was occupied. I had helicopters. My office building, I saw my office window on CNN because of all the protests and all the police response and all the helicopters. Now, I remember when this happened, that very night when I saw that police officer on top of the armored vehicle with his rifle aimed right at the protesters, I thought, oh my, this is not going to go well. This is not going to go well. I was a sharpshooter. I can't imagine ever having to do that as a police officer. That looks like something you'd see in a war. Next slide. So, at a faculty meeting right after that, and our Department of Theology at St. Louis University had between 20 and 30 faculty members, and the department meets almost every week. We were having a meeting, even though it was the summertime, we were having a meeting to get ready for the fall semester, and I'm sorry, I was getting messages from a lot of friends around the country. What are your thoughts on what has happened? So during the meeting, I wasn't paying attention. I actually was writing an article, and it made the cover of Christian Century magazine, which is a major Protestant Christian ecumenical magazine, and it's called The Warrior Cop, and it got a lot of attention. Somebody even read it at the White House. And for the following year, I was included in weekly conference calls with the Justice Department and the White House on how do we address this problem. And then on the right there, that's a magazine out of London, and that's just from 2 summers ago. They asked me to write about white supremacy, white privilege, and the police. And so the week before, an African-American Catholic ethicist, a friend of mine, Brian Massengale, do you know Brian? The tablet asked me to write an article. I said, I think you should have Brian Massengale do an article first. He's African-American, and he's written books about racism and theology and his experiences. I said, he's also a priest, so let him write the first article, and because he's a priest, I'm Catholic, my response article will be in the form of a confession. A confession. Next. 2020, Louisville, Breonna Taylor. The no-knock warrants, that's a major issue. Police didn't always use to do that. It started kind of in the 1970s, and it's been in the news again recently, and many cities now are putting moratorium on it. They do it very early in the morning, catch people by surprise, but often they go wrong. Wrong address, wrong persons, people end up dying. I don't know about you, but if somebody breaks into my home at 5 a.m., I don't know who it is. You've got a couple of seconds to think and to respond and react. And most people react in a defensive mode. It's very dangerous, actually, for the police. It actually makes things worse for them, studies are now showing. Next slide. George Floyd. I've written several articles on that for popular magazines. When I saw Derek Chauvin with his knee on his neck for over 8 minutes, I mean, almost every cop I know thought that was wrong. Okay, it was just incredible. Next. Sorry, I don't have a clicker tonight. So there's the data. How many people have been shot by police? And I don't have 2022 yet. And that's from that's the end of October 2021. I should have updated that. But I think by the end of 2021, it was probably close to the 900. It was in the 900s, maybe a little bit down from the 1,021 from 2020. So I'd have to go back and check that. I'm sorry about that. But regardless, the last almost decade, it's 900 to 1,100 a year that are shot. Next slide. And killed. 25% have mental health problems. I live in downtown St. Louis, where the tall buildings are. I run every day. I know a lot of the homeless people, they know me. And a lot of them have mental health problems, and sometimes the police are not trained properly. The training I had when I was in law enforcement wasn't enough. That second picture that was up there earlier with me when I graduated from the academy, when I was your age in 1984, the second picture in a darker uniform was with she was my future wife, and that was for Des Moines PD. When I taught at Simpson College for 5 years, although I was a religion professor, I also volunteered part-time and taught ethics for the police department, and I patrolled with them. And I would be at shootings, and I would pull people over, do all that stuff. So I still did policing again up in Des Moines, Iowa for a while. But many people, before the 1980s, we had much more mental health programming in this country. And then for several years, we started shutting those things down, and many people ended up instead in our jails, in our prisons. Half the people shot and killed by police are white, but black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate. They account for less than 13% of our population, but are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. And Hispanic Americans are also killed by police at a disproportionate rate. So this is a problem. Next slide. I was born and raised Catholic. I was pretty much a very serious, young, religious person. In high school, I became a little bit more involved in the Methodists. I had Methodist friends in a youth group and got into Bible study, stuff like that. So part of my questioning about these issues when I was in law enforcement and when I was an undergraduate was because of my Christian identity. So more than 7 in 10 white evangelical Protestants, 71% of white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics, 77%, believe that police across the country are doing an excellent or a good job. Fewer than half of black Protestants, though, 45%, say the same. Why the discrepancy? Next slide. So we've had, especially since George Floyd, calls to defund the police, abolish the police, or reform. And I've been involved in these debates. Next slide. Now, one of the things I'll just note from a historical perspective, look up there, you see some, we call them bobbies. London, England, you see similar in Ireland. And I've been to those places many times, and I'm amazed that most of them, the vast majority, are not wearing guns. Sometimes when there's a heightened terrorist alert, you see some special officers designated with more weapons, but most of them are not. And then here over in the United States, well, like the cover of that magazine that had my story, we look like warriors, SWAT, military gear. Very, very drastically different. How did that happen? Next slide. And then, as a Christian and as a theologian, I learned that violence has always been a moral issue in our tradition. The earliest Christians, they thought it was a serious problem. And throughout most of the history of Christianity, most theologians that address the topic, they thought it was an issue that needs to be addressed. It's not something that's just a good thing. And criminal justice has been a part of the Christian tradition too. Penitentiaries, penance. There's a lot of background in prisons, even with regard to our notions of justice, retributive justice, restorative justice. These kinds of things have theological roots. Next slide. Policing, though, has been neglected, and I think it's just curious because Christians claim that Jesus is our Prince of Peace. You've seen the line WWJD, that was popular when I was young. It was popular 100 years ago. It comes and goes, but it's WWJD. It's not we want Jack Daniels, okay? And I'm trying to see if you're awake now. So what would Jesus do? I asked that question. When I was wearing a badge and a 9mm, I wondered, can I see Jesus? I claim to follow him. Can I see him wearing a badge and a 9mm? Next slide. So going back to the question about violence and Christian ethics, Lisa Cahill at Boston College has written a lot on it. And she says the challenge to decide about violence, especially state-supported violence, has been with Christians from the beginning. That other guy at the bottom there, Stanley Hauerwas, in 2001, just a few weeks before 9/11 happened, Time magazine said that he's America's best theologian. He was one of my professors at Duke. And he's a pacifist. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But he said the question of violence is the central issue for any Christian social ethic. If that's the case, I then thought, wow, let's see what Christian theologians and ethicists have to say about policing and the use of force. Next slide. At first, I found that they hadn't said anything about police and the use of force. But they had said a lot about war and peace. And there's a spectrum. There's kind of a more militaristic approach, pro-military, Rambo, no rules, just win. Might makes right. In the middle, there's just war approach, and Kevin and I are both in that camp, and there are certain rules, and a play on my last name's supposed to be Wainwright, like the pitcher at the Cardinals, but my ancestors who came over in the late 1600s from England to the colonies, they didn't know how to spell. Sometimes it was Wainwright, sometimes they spelled it without an A, and I inherited it without an A. Mine's Winright. And so a just war person, they wants to win, but only rightly, by doing the right things, by not breaking the rules, okay? There's certain rules that you follow. And then the pacifists, like my teacher Stanley Hauerwas, no violence, no war, no killing, no police, across the board pretty much. Now, I'm generalizing, I'm simplifying. There's different subsets in all these things, okay? But that's where I saw most Christian theologians, historically, they focused on that level. Next slide. After 9/11 happened, my teacher Hauerwas, who's the pacifist, he thought war is bad, which everybody knew he'd say that, don't go to war. But it was interesting, I saw that he considered maybe we should see it as what happened was not an act of war that Al-Qaeda did, but it was actually a crime, mass murder. It was a crime against humanity. And so he thought maybe if we imagine something that looked more like a police response to it, some police sort of response he thought would be better. And he said he would support that himself but he drew a line at if he ever had to carry a gun. All right, next line. Next slide. Then here's some Quaker quotes. Quaker is a historic peace church, pacifist, and there's just a few persons there, like after 9/11 happened and terrorism, that Tom Ryan said, we are a peace church, but there are some people who are worried that's enough. Maybe some sort of police action would be okay. Another Quaker there thought that maybe a limited police action would be justified, but he said, I feel less Quakerly saying so. Okay? So I noticed a lot of my friends who take violence very, very seriously, to the point of where they're pacifists. They were like, wow, well, maybe there's something that we could support. But they weren't sure. And nobody had ever really addressed this question thoroughly. Next slide. The other issue, though, that I said that I faced was racism. Now, I was born in northern Ohio, a farm. I was born in a town called Hicksville, Ohio. I went to a school that only had 4 rooms, elementary school, and everybody looked just like me. In fact, we were all related. It was hard to find somebody to date, but everybody looked just like me. When I moved to Florida, diversity. When I started working in law enforcement, some of my best friends were African American, fellow officers. And some of those other officers, though, some were not good officers. One I remember, at roll call one night, he was so proud he brought in a thank you card from the government of South Africa and a flag from South Africa. This is in the 1980s. Apartheid was going on down there. Serious racism. And he had written them a letter supporting apartheid, supporting the government. And he was proud at roll call about that. I was bothered by that. James Cone is a Christian ethicist, a theologian, and he wrote like this line here: if one read only white Catholic theologians, one would hardly know that blacks exist in America or had the capacity for thought about God. I also noticed like racism, like policing, has been kind of a blind spot in a lot of Christian theology and ethics. Next slide. I did find a couple of scholars that wrote just a little about policing. Ralph Potter at Harvard, he said, seldom have American Christian scholars addressed themselves seriously to the task of helping public officers reflect upon the mode of reasoning appropriate to their office that would guide them and determine how they should act and why. And then Ed Malloy, he was the president of Notre Dame where I did my doctorate, and he did a little booklet on criminal justice, and he had a chapter on the ethics of law enforcement in that book. And he said there's a deficiency in applying analysis to domestic context of crime and punishment. This is from 1982. Potter's 1973. So that's about all I could find. Some theologians, some ethicists starting to think somebody needs to start writing about policing and the problems that police officers face. Next line. Next slide, I mean. So you know what? When I started writing about this, I had to turn to literature in criminal justice and criminology and sociology and learn what they had to say. And one of the persons I relied on is John Kleinig, and he was editor of a journal out of the John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York City called Criminal Justice Ethics. My very first article ever in 1995 was in that journal on this topic. And his book from Cambridge University Press, The Ethics of Policing, I relied on that for my dissertation. Now, he's a philosopher, a secular philosopher, not a theologian. He may be a Christian, I don't know, but he didn't include that perspective in anything he did. So I had to rely on his research and then connect it with my own experience and the scholarship I could find from theological circles. Next slide, please. Kleinig identifies different models. There's actually more than this of policing. Police, as we know it, it's not the same wherever you go around the world. Police departments can be very different from one country to the next. I mentioned already United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. We could go on around the world. Not all police departments look the same. Just about every country, every culture has something that I would call a police function. There's somebody in every community designated to serve and protect the community. Call it what you may. We call them police for the most part, but police are not all armed like we are everywhere else. How did we become what we are? And even here in the United States, we've got different models circulating, and in criminological literature, and this isn't just Kleinig, I mean, there's this crime fighter or military model that has become dominant in the United States. Actually, it has just in the last 40, 50 years. That's not the way it used to be even here. You got some other models in between, and then I'll jump down to number 4, the social peacekeeper model, community policing, or sometimes I call it just policing. The title of this talk, Just and Unjust Policing, is actually an echo of a book by Michael Walzer called Just and Unjust War. So there's just and unjust policing, and maybe there is policing somewhere that's actually just. Maybe there's policing in places that's not so just. Next. The warrior model. There's a book by Radley Balco I recommend. He's more of a journalist than a scholar. But the war metaphors, I saw this a lot on the job. A lot of my fellow officers, especially in the 80s, were Vietnam veterans. And as sometimes they said, it's like war out there. Got the sergeants, the captains, the lieutenants, the majors, the colonels. We've got the military equipment. This model emphasizes the use of force. This is the model you see in a lot of TV shows and movies. The gun is the symbol of the job. It also has some scholars see it as flowing from kind of some classic liberal philosophy, Thomas Hobbes I put up there, kind of a more negative view of the human person and society. Okay? Next slide. The opposite of that would be the social peacekeeping model, or just policing. Kleinig recommends that, and I'll say a little bit more. Its roots are Sir Robert Peel, 1829, who started the new police of the Metropolitan London. That's where they get the name Bobby, Sir Robert Peel. Bobby, Robert, that's why they're called Bobbies. And he wanted the police to be more community-oriented. He wanted them to be citizens, not soldiers. He wanted them to be proactive, not reactive, so try to help the community address the root causes of crime, rather than just arrest people or use force on them. He thought use of force might be necessary, but they didn't have guns, they didn't use swords. In fact, he had them wear blue instead of red. The British redcoats, the military, they would come in galloping with their swords, and a lot of people would get killed. The blue coats, they came in, maybe they would have a truncheon at most, a little club, but they were unarmed, relatively speaking. And in fact, some of them got killed when they responded to the first riots. And the British public, at first, was very skeptical about the police. They thought it was going to be another government kind of occupying force. But when these unarmed British bobbies responded with minimal force, non-violently, and some of them got killed, that won the public over. They were an alternative to the military in their origins. Next slide. And as I said earlier, the police function is something that can be found in a lot of different, even here in like ancient Greece, Rome, the polis, the vigiles, there's the hue and cry, the shire reeve, the sheriff, constables, night watch, and we could do an anthropological survey around the country, and different cultures will call them different things, okay? Next slide. There's Peel's Principles of Law Enforcement, and they're pretty small. You can't read them, but number 6, the police should use physical force to the extent necessary to secure observance of the law or to restore order only when the exercise of persuasion, advice, and warning is found to be insufficient to achieve police objectives. And police should use only the minimum degree of physical force which is necessary. on any particular occasion for achieving the police objective. So that force, instrumental, last resort, minimal in this model. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little theology, go a little Christian for a moment. Oh, we got about 15 more minutes. I think we're good, right? So, image of God, imago Dei, sanctity of life, all that stuff that maybe you've heard somewhere in church or in a religion course. But John Paul II, who came to St. Louis in 1999 even, he talked about racism there as a major problem in St. Louis in 1999. And he also talked about the death penalty at the Basilica there, that Missouri should abolish it. And he talked about not even a murderer loses their dignity as God's image. Now, I have been this close to murderers who told me to my face that were they not handcuffed, they would not hesitate to try to kill me. It's hard to see a murderer, some of the ones I'm picturing in my head right now after all these decades, as image of God. The image of God is not something that's earned, and it's not something that can be lost. It's something inherent, God-given. And Pope John Paul II, he actually went beyond Aquinas on this. Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, he relied on Aristotle and compared a murderer to a beast. And, we put down a beast for the good of society. John Paul II said no to that. Pope Francis, the current pope, has said similar things, that all people, even those who have done the worst things imaginable, the last quote up there, if I do not deny the dignity to the worst criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. It's kind of a litmus test. Your respect for the human dignity of others. Next slide. Genesis. It says there that, the human ones, Adam and Eve in the garden to till and keep it. There's a scripture scholar up at Hope College. He says one of the best translations for that, till and keep, is actually what used to be on the side of my squad cars, to serve and protect, to care for. So Pope Francis has issued a big major document on the environment, ecology. I teach about that stuff too. And it's called On Care for Laudato Si, but in English it's On Care for Our Common Home. The till and keep thing, to serve and protect. Also the parable of the Good Samaritan. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the greatest thing. And then Jesus was asked, who's your neighbor? And he tells his story about a man who's beaten by robbers. And two religious, respected persons walk on by, don't even stop to help the person. And they had reasons. But the third person that comes along is a Samaritan who was actually regarded as enemy or other to the other persons that went on by and to the victim. And the Samaritan actually showed love for the victim and helped him to become recovered. So Paul Ramsey, who's a Methodist theologian and ethicist from the 20th century, Kevin Carnahan here has written extensively about him. And I just got to say, you're so lucky to have him here. I just reviewed a book on just war theory from England by a German author, and I read another major article in a journal by Lisa Cahill that showed up there earlier on just war. He is footnoted and cited in these things from around the world on this topic. He's incredible. He's a smart guy. And I'm lucky to have him as a friend. So he's written a lot about this guy, Paul Ramsey, up here, more than I have even. But Paul Ramsey, he talked a lot. He wrote about just war theory, but every now and then he referred to policing. When I went back and reread them, I'm like, oh, I don't have to start from scratch after all. Some theologians have written about it. So he said, the moral economy of the just war tradition, morally, if not legally blinding upon the use of force between nations, and it also regulates the use of force within political communities, where it is both morally and legally blinding. There he's talking about the use of force continuum. You know, the stuff from Peel there about minimal force, only when you have just cause, to defend an innocent from an aggressor. That's what he's referring to there. That's pretty much standard operating procedure. That's pretty much the laws here, legally binding. But it's also morally, from a theological perspective. That's the ethics of it. Ralph Potter from Harvard and Malloy from Notre Dame said similar things, very briefly. They said, you know, when we try to make sure only the necessary amount of force as a last resort is used, that's in sync with the Christian tradition known as just war theory. Next slide. So, you know, back to the racism issue. These are some relatively recent books that I've read. I'm working on a new book on the whole subject right now. I've already done one book on policing called Serve and Protect that came out 2 years ago. I've got another one coming out that's all new stuff. That's going to, I've always written about the racism aspect, but there's a connection. There's a correlation between excessive force and brutality, as we saw earlier, and race. And a lot of that has to do with how policing has, I wanted to say evolved, but maybe I should say devolved in this country. Now, in the South, I lived in Florida, I lived in North Carolina. In the South, policing had its origins in the slave patrols. And some persons in these books, they'll say that all policing in the United States has its roots in that. That's kind of inaccurate. In the South, they did. In Philadelphia, Boston, New York, where policing first started in the 1830s. Remember Sir Robert Peel started policing in 1829 in London? Well, that was transplanted to New England. That was transplanted there. The police in the northern states were unarmed. They were much more like the bobbies. In the South, there were slave patrols. Now, over the decades, over the centuries, that has migrated north. After the Civil War, when there was a surplus of guns everywhere and a lot of the men went back to their cities in the north with their jobs, some of them started carrying their guns on the job of policing. But when did the police really become armed like they are? Guess what? Al Capone, Derringer, the 1920s, the gangster. They started having more guns, they had cars. That's when the police started using cars. That's when they started using radios. That's when they started having guns. They didn't walk the beat as much. They didn't know their community as much. There's transformations. Next slide. Alex Vitale, he's been in the news a lot. In fact, his book is up there again as a bestseller from a couple years ago, but just recently, during the hearings for the Supreme Court Justice, Ted Cruz held up this book by Alex Vitale and asked, what are your thoughts? Are you for the abolition of the police? The title of that sounds like the abolition of police, and a lot of people have highlighted it as about police abolition. Vitale is a sociologist, and I've read that book a couple times now, and I've written some about it. I'm using it. But you know what? That end of policing, it's not just about abolishing the police. Now I'm going to talk a little bit philosophical and theological. In Greek, the word end is telos, which means purpose. The purpose of the police. Their end, their goal. He actually talks quite a bit about that in this book, too. He's not just saying do it. He's actually talking about let's do away with the police as we know them now, but we need to have something, and what will its end or we need to have police that have the proper end or purpose. And that's the cover of my book that came out 2 years ago on the topic. Next slide. So there's Vattel. Look at that. Rethink the role of the police in the society. He's not saying, get rid of it. Now, like I said, he is invoked probably the most. And he's like, rethink the role of the police. And there he uses words, orientation, their mindset, the culture, the basic mission, the basic role. He's talking about, all this stuff is more about ethics, actually. Reform within a larger vision that questions the basic role of police in society and asks whether coercive government action will bring more justice or less. So he is worried about coercive force. But what will actually make it less rather than make it more? He's not a pacifist. He's not naive. He talks about we need to find alternatives, study other places. How is it done in other places? He says we can't just have technocratic fixes. Cameras, we put all our, there's a golden bullet, this camera, this, that, and the other. That's might help, but it's really more about the ethos, the culture, the mindset. So that's what I think that he's really talking more about, is like what we need is something more just. Next slide. This is a Canadian scholar, and on a lot of the proposals for abolition, she says the problem with these proposals is that they're presented as solutions to police abuse without an appreciation that some element of coercive authority will still be required in a society. Consequently, these efforts are unlikely to be successful. Many of the calls for drastic change highlight the failure of police reform efforts. She acknowledges, we've attempted to reform police over the decades. Community policing was big in the 80s and 90s. Then other administration, it kind of is a pendulum, back and forth. And there's been a lot of failures. There's been a lot of mistakes. Hopefully you learn from your mistakes. She acknowledges that, as I do. While many, not all, attempts to change have met with limited success, I suggest the reason for these outcomes is not because change is impossible. It's more to do with an unwillingness to confront systemic issues within police forces. Racism, militarism, these kinds of systemic ethos, cultural, attitudinal issues that have become ingrained. That's what she's saying. And just to say abolish, that's getting our attention, rightly so. But the real work is some sort of reform. Next slide. Now, let me go a little bit more pacifist here, and now not Christian, although he is very much inspired by Leo Tolstoy and the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus, Gandhi, Indian, Hindu, also some Jain influence, known for his nonviolent resistance. If you're interested, I'll give you the source. I don't have it up here, I'm sorry. Even under a government based primarily on nonviolence, a small police force will be necessary. The police, in my conception, will be of a wholly different pattern from the present-day force. Its ranks will be composed of believers in nonviolence. They will be servants, not masters. Serve, care for, protect. Not masters of the people. And through mutual cooperation, community-oriented cooperation with others, they will easily deal with the ever-decreasing disturbances. Now, this last part. The police force will have some kind of arms. Oh, he just said that they'd be believers in nonviolence, though. They will have some kind of arms, but they will be rarely used, if at all. In fact, the policemen will be reformers. So, this is pretty radical perspective from, this was, I think, in the 1940s, and a lot of my pacifist colleagues and friends, they're not aware of this. Martin Luther King Jr. was very much inspired by him. And I was just, last year for spring break, my daughters and I, I have a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old. Last year, they were a year younger, obviously. We went to Memphis, to where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Now, he had police out there that were supposed to be protecting him. In fact, they were right there next to where the shooter was. If you've gone there recently, they've done a whole great job across the street from there where the shooter was, and the police were, and they blew it. But he relied on police for protection, even though he is critical of the police, such as in Selma. Next slide. So given the end of just policing, what should be done for genuine reform? John Paul Lederach's a Notre Dame scholar on peacemaking, peace, and justice. He's pretty much nonviolence, but he has actually written an article in response to one of my articles, and he's like, you know what, there's actually doables. We can reform the police. There are doables. We can reform hiring. Maybe we shouldn't just hire automatically people who have military experience. We need to hire more people with college education, with other experiences. I mean, I was in ROTC. I didn't go military, but I did train at Fort Benning for a while. My training at Fort Benning was a little bit different than my training in the police academy. And you know what? In the policing, the training I had in the military level might not be appropriate. There's training reforms. Most academies, oh my goodness, so much attention is given to shooting and shooting well. Not much attention to de-escalation, to how to work with other partners in the community. Like in Eugene, Oregon, they have a CAHOOTS program, social workers and behavioral health professionals that actually can respond to the call with the police in order to deal with persons and try to de-escalate things so that violence, hopefully, will be a lot less likely to occur. There's institutional reforms, as I said, too. Just this past November, I was in Seattle for a conference on this topic of scholars from all sorts of disciplines. And there was a police chief there, and his police department in Texas, they did away with the ranks, captain, lieutenant. They changed the uniforms so they look less military. And guess what? Just these kinds of, they might just sound cosmetic to you, but they, over time, changed their attitudes into more like public servants rather than an us versus them mentality. Next slide. I go to Ireland a lot. They're called the Garda Síochána. The police there are called the Guardians of the Peace. You know what? Here in the United States, we've got, what's it called? The law enforcement officers here, post training. Peace officer standards training. Peace, we used to call each other peace officers. Just that word alone prioritizes something, I think, rightly. And I think that's very consonant with what I said earlier. You don't have to be religious to believe in it, but from a religious perspective, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think that's the last slide. Is it? Q&A time. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have a question for our speaker?
Yes, up there. Yes. That's fine. I'm nobody. So just one example real quick. So asking me what's the best way to do some reform. And there's actually different kinds of reform too, and I'm not going to get too academic on that. But in St. Louis, for example, I meet with the city sheriff, not of the police department, the chief of the police department, but the city sheriff. Once a month we have lunch. We're friends. He's African American. Most of the sheriff's department is African American. The police department, however, is not. They need to recruit, especially from North St. Louis. They need to recruit and have more cadets. They're starting to do more cadets with our new mayor, starting to have like community college credits so that they can get community college like I did, and try to make it where in Northern Ireland, where you had Protestant, Catholic, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was vast majority was Protestant, and they were in power, and they were in charge, and the Catholics were the minority, and they were abused. Now, after 2000, 2001, they've been trying to make their police up in Northern Ireland 50-50. So it's more representative of the citizens. We need to do that in most of our cities. We need to have police who are actually from the community, in, of, and from the community. That's one example. Does that help? I mean, there's many, many more things. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So thank you. So this had to do with guns. Why do police in this country have more guns? This country has more guns, the citizens. We've got, I think, about 400 million guns right now in a country that's got 325 million people. Now, not all U.S. citizens have guns. There's it's a small percentage that do, and a lot of them have more than one. And so there's that issue, definitely is a big issue. So in a lot of my writings, I talk about how the police actually, in this militarization stuff and the racism stuff, are actually mirroring the society, and even on racism. So there's implicit bias training, shoot, don't shoot exercises that police officers do. And studies have been done that, yes, most police officers, even non-white police officers, tend to shoot at a suspicious person who is a person of color than a white person. But do you know what the studies also show? Non-police public do it even worse. They do it even worse. And that you do the implicit training and you work on that and try to help them to be mindful of it, the police actually improve vastly. They're much less in error on that. They came into law enforcement and their training was bad for such a long time, but they're pretty much, when they become cops, they still have the attitudes, the values, the assumptions of their culture. So that is something that's wider in our society, as well as the gun thing. This is something that is pretty much, it's not a pandemic, which is worldwide, it's an epidemic. It's something we've got. Other places do have it to some extent, maybe because we're actually exporting it. We're good at exporting a lot of our values and stuff too, and I hope we don't export this too much. But yes, we've got a lot of different things that we need to address, and that actually is a point that I make to try to support my point about reform. That it's not the police per se that's the problem; it's how they've tended to reflect these deep problems in our society and our culture. Another hand somewhere here. Wait, is there? Oh, right there. Yes, sir. Yes.
Do you think that a college degree should be a necessity to become a police officer? And if so, a degree in what field?
So is a college degree necessary to be in the field? And if so, what degree? I was political science and history, and so I wasn't criminal justice. And criminal justice departments vary from college or university to college and university. So it's hard to say a one-size thing and be general about this. But I do think, and we've been saying this actually since the Kerner Commission in 1968, we need to hire more people with at least a 2-year degree. Because you do take courses in psychology, sociology, English, even report writing. I used to remember judges that got really upset at terrible reports that officers would write. So the thing is, we got to make it accessible and available. And so any major, I think, would be great. It doesn't have to be criminal justice. Other majors would be great. I've had some from religion and theology go into it. And so anything, but something that definitely helps you to think outside of your box, that really helps you to see things in other person's perspectives. I think is truly helpful. So Bonne Terre has one of our state prisons where we do executions. St. Louis University several years ago, we started a degree program there. Most in-prison degree programs are for the inmates. My idea was, let's offer the associate's degree also for free, not only to inmates, but also to officers. Because like me, most of them can't afford college. They couldn't afford a college. And now, those officers that go through this program, just like the inmates, they are in tears when they get that diploma. It changes their life. It gives them meaning and purpose. You've got inmates now reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, and so the officers, and they're talking about it. And guess what? We are monitoring and surveying use of force incidents in that prison decline amongst those who are involved in this program. And you know what? It costs a lot, but it costs a lot less than just putting people in prison and leaving them there. Or, it's actually cost effective in many ways. Thanks.
I would like to change your focus for a minute and go back to the just war theory that seems to be going through a great evolution right now. And I'd like to hear your commentary on this evolution in terms of just war theory.
So, yes, right now with what's going on in Ukraine, but not only with that, but my own tradition, the Catholic Church, the Pope, Francis, whom I've met. I didn't put the picture up there. I've been there a couple times for meetings about nuclear disarmament, and with NATO leaders and people from other governments. So he has talked about nonviolence, and there is no such thing as holy war, and he's even said there's no just war, and he's been critical of it. How a pope speaks about things is different than how a theologian, it's a pastoral level. It's not necessarily a systematic theological level. The popes have always pretty much talked that way. But just war is coming under a lot of critique. There's actually many different kinds of just war theory, some that are more hawkish, some that are more dovish, and I've written a lot about that. And my point is that any use of force, at the war level, the police level, I do Taekwondo. I've done Taekwondo since 1985. It's called a martial art, but the founders of most of the martial arts actually talk about peace. They're actually for peace, and it's actually, you're the best martial artist if you never use it. Or you only use it as a very last resort, and you only use proportionate minimal force. So whatever we call it, the tradition is called it just war. We sometimes call it humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, R2P. So whatever we call it, it's got some reasoning and principles that hopefully are meant to ultimately lead to a just peace for all, including the aggressor and the aggressor's people. So yeah, that's a big topic. Thank you for asking.